The letter arrived before she did. Not in any mailbox, not through any postal route. It arrived the way certain things arrive, written years before anyone knew who would read it, sealed in an envelope and pressed into a dark place underground, waiting with the patience of something that understood time differently than the people above it. The letter began, "For whoever finds this place," but that comes later. First, there is a courthouse in Harlow, Montana, on a Tuesday in March, and a girl who has never owned anything, standing in a room that smells like old wood, in the particular staleness of a space used only occasionally for auctions and estate hearings, and the official recording of things that have ended. Her name is Lena Calloway. She is 18 years old. She is wearing a red and cream flannel shirt with the collar turned up against the March cold layered under a canvas jacket, the color of caramel gone brown at the edges, the kind of jacket that has been softened by years of use into something that fits like a second skin. Her jeans are faded at the knees and thighs in the way that jeans get faded from actual work rather than a factory process. Her hair is medium brown with warm chestnut undertones and faint traces of gold from seasons spent outdoors, pulled back in a loose, low ponytail with several strands escaping around her forehead and temples. Her eyes are a light blue-gray, large and expressive, in a face that is young and delicate and carries in its set in the particular angle of her jaw, in the way she holds her mouth, the expression of someone who has already learned that rooms full of strangers are not usually in her favor. She has $121 in her coat pocket. She spent $7 of the $128 she arrived with on the bid. That is what she has. That is what she has ever had. In the folding chairs ahead of her sit six men. They range from perhaps 60 to perhaps 80 years old. They have the look of men who attend county auctions with the casual regularity of people who find these events useful and entertaining in roughly equal measure. They are not cruel men. They do not need to be. When Lena raised her hand in that room and said $7, they exchanged glances with the practiced ease of people who have communicated without words for decades. The glances said, "Look at that." The glances said she has no idea what she's walked into. Lena looked back at them and said nothing. She had been saying nothing to rooms like that for most of her life. She had learned the economy of it. Silence cost less and usually held its value better than anything she might have spent on a response. The county clerk, a thin man named Henderson, who read from a clipboard with the flat delivery of someone recording inventory, had moved through 3 prior properties in 20 minutes. An empty lot, a burned-out structure on the edge of town, 30 acres of scrub land along a dried creek bed, each sold with the brevity of things no one much wanted. Then he reached the last item. 80 acres, Section 12, Township 4 North. 1 farmhouse, 1 barn, various outbuildings, condition aces, outstanding tax debt of $6,200. Minimum bid $5. Nobody moved. The clock on the wall ticked once. Someone in the hallway outside dropped something metal. The sound rang through the old building and faded into nothing. Henderson said $5 again in a tone that suggested he would be saying it into an empty room if necessary. Lena raised her hand. $7. The room shifted, not dramatically, more the way a room shifts when something happens that falls outside its expected parameters, when the machinery of ordinary events catches briefly on something unexpected and then resumes. The men turned. They looked at her, not with cruelty, with the involuntary attention people give to things they cannot immediately categorize. "Going once," Henderson said. "Going twice." The gavel came down. Lena walked to the front of the room on legs that felt like they belonged to someone slightly uncertain of their own body. She signed her name on the transfer document. Her hand was shaking, but the signature was clear. Lena Calloway. She had been signing that name to documents all her life. Case files, placement records, the forms that passed her from one temporary situation to the next. And it had never meant anything attached to the earth before. It had always been a name that floated, that belonged to no particular place, that could be picked up and moved without leaving a mark. Henderson handed her a receipt in a small envelope. Inside the envelope were 2 keys so oxidized with rust that they looked more like artifacts than functional objects. "Congratulations," he said, without any warmth at all. "You have 90 days to settle the outstanding tax debt or the county reclaims the property." 90 days, $6,200. She had $121 and no plan. But she had something she had never had before. She had a place with her name attached to it. She walked out of the courthouse into the March air of Harlow, Montana, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The main street ran 4 blocks. A feed store at one end with a sign bleached nearly white by decades of sun. A diner at the other end, smoke rising from a metal chimney pipe. Between them, a hardware store, a post office the size of a closet, a church with a hand-lettered marquee, and 2 empty storefronts with plywood where glass used to be. It was not much of a town. But then again, it was not nothing. She had been born here. The birth certificate in her inside jacket pocket said so. Harlow, Montana. Mother Jessie Calloway. Father unknown. She had carried that document for 2 years, ever since the morning a woman named Mrs. Polson handed her a small cardboard box at St. Benedict's Children's Home in Lincoln, Nebraska, and said those were all her mother's effects, and there was nothing else in the file. Inside the box had been 3 things. A silver ring tarnished, almost black with the initials EC etched on the inside band. A birth certificate, and a Polaroid photograph, soft around the edges the way old photographs get the colors fading toward yellow. A young woman stood in front of a white farmhouse with one hand raised to shade her eyes from the sun. She was young, maybe 17. She was smiling in a way that looked almost defiant, like she was daring the camera to catch something she wasn't ready to give away. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in careful cursive, "Mama's Place, Harlow, Montana, 1999. That woman was Jessie Calloway. She was Lena's mother. She had died in a car accident in a different state when Lena was 4 years old. Lena had no memory of her face. She had only the Polaroid, which she had studied for 2 years with the intensity of someone trying to read a language they had never been taught. She recognized the jaw, the set of it. She saw it in the mirror every morning, that same angle, that same quality of bracing. She had also found tucked under the birth certificate a letter, old and fragile at the fold lines, addressed to Jessie, written in handwriting that was careful and slightly formal, the handwriting of someone who had learned penmanship when penmanship was considered a serious discipline. "My dearest Jessie," it began, "I don't know if you will ever come back. But if you do, or if someone who belongs to you does look under the barn, your grandfather built it during the war. I've kept it up. Everything you'd need to start over is down there. Come home. Please come home. All my love, your grandmother Evelyn." The letter was unsigned with a date, but the property records Lena had found in a library in Billings 2 weeks before the auction showed that Evelyn Calloway had died 11 weeks ago in January. The property had sat since then. The taxes had accumulated. The county had scheduled the auction. 3 days. That was how much time Lena had had between finding the records and the auction. She had spent $7 of her remaining money to get to a courthouse and raise her hand. Now she had a receipt and 2 rusted keys and a walk ahead of her. The road to the farm took just under 2 hours on foot, shifting from asphalt to gravel to packed dirt as it moved away from town. The fields on either side had gone wild with years of neglect. Brown grass stood chest-high in places, moving in the wind like something restless and alive. The sky overhead was enormous, the kind of sky that does not exist in cities or institutions, where the horizon is always interrupted by something built by human hands. Lena had been working on farms since she was 16. After she aged out of the system, she had moved from one hired position to the next. An apple orchard in Bozeman, a grain operation outside Casper, a cattle property in the Upper Snake River Valley. She knew how to read soil by its color and texture before you turned it. She knew how weather built in the west before it showed itself in the clouds. She knew how wood spoke when it was failing, how a fence line communicated its weaknesses through posture rather than collapse. She had learned all of this in other people's fields, on other people's land, doing work that fed her and moved her forward and gave her confidence she could carry anywhere. What it had not given her was a place where that competence was building something for herself. She had been building someone else's life for 2 years. She was good at it. It had kept her warm and moving, and it had led her through a library computer and a property record and a $7 bid to this road in this wind under this enormous Montana sky. The house appeared before she was ready for it. It rose from the flat land around it the way things rise that have been there a very long time, with the particular authority of the long-rooted. White paint peeled from the clapboards in long curling strips. The porch sagged badly on the left side, one support post gone entirely. 3 windows on the upper floor were open holes where glass had been. The roof she stopped when she saw the roof. A full section of it on the northwest corner had collapsed, leaving a jagged opening that exposed the attic to whatever the sky intended to send. Behind the house, a barn leaned east at an angle that seemed to argue with physics. Red paint faded to the color of dried blood. The doors hung open at irregular angles. The grass had taken over everything, swallowing what might once have been a path from the road, rising around the base of the house in a slow, patient siege. Lena stood at the edge of the property for a long time. The wind came across the fields from the west and pushed against her steady and indifferent. She thought about turning around. She had enough left for a bus ticket somewhere warmer. She knew how to find another hired position, another borrowed bunk, another season of work on someone else's land. She had tried that life for 2 years. She knew where it led. She took a breath and walked toward the house. The front door was not locked. It was not fully closed. The frame had warped enough that the door sat crooked in its opening, leaving a gap at the top wide enough for weather and small animals to pass through without negotiation. When she pushed it, it moved with a sound that was somewhere between wood and rust and time. The smell hit her first, mold and decay, and the particular sweet sourness of a place closed up and forgotten. Underneath that something older, wood smoke, maybe the ghost of 100 years of winters. She stepped inside. The living room had been beautiful once. She could see it beneath the damage the way you can sometimes see a person beneath what the years have done to them. High ceilings, a stone fireplace running nearly floor to ceiling on the far wall, the stones fitted together without mortar in the old way, each one chosen for how it sat against its neighbors. Windows that would have let light in on 3 sides. Wide plank floors, golden once, and now soft and buckled with water damage. She moved through slowly testing each step before she committed her weight. Kitchen. Counters crumbled at the edges. The sink hung loose from the wall. A window above it looked out on what had been a kitchen garden, now a tangle of dead stems and frost-hard ground. A bedroom. A mattress reduced to springs. A dresser with 3 drawers and one missing. A back room that might have been a sitting room or a sewing room or both at different times. A bookshelf still standing, still holding books. Farming guides and veterinary manuals and several novels and a Bible with a cracked spine. A rocking chair with its cushion chewed down to the stuffing, but its frame solid and unbroken. A basket of yarn, the skeins faded but the colors still visible underneath. Cornflower blue. The warm gold of a field in August, and on-the-wall photographs. She approached them carefully. Old ones, many of them black and white edges soft. A man in overalls beside an ancient tractor. A woman in a floral dress holding an infant up toward the camera. 2 children running toward whoever was taking the picture. Mouths open in laughter that had happened so long ago it had passed through time and become something almost abstract. In the center, in a frame made of hammered silver gone gray with age, was a photograph she recognized. A young woman, maybe 17, standing in front of this house, one hand raised to shade her eyes. That jaw, that defiant, almost daring smile. Her mother, Jessie Calloway, had stood in this room. She had looked at these walls. She had been a person in this house with a name and a family and a place in the world. And then something had happened, and she had gone. And 17 years later, she had died in a state far from here, leaving behind a 4-year-old girl and a cardboard box and a photograph that had taken Lena 2 years to follow home. She reached out and touched the glass of the frame. It was cool under her fingers, solid, real. She sat down on the floor and she cried. Not the practiced, quiet crying of someone who has learned to do it without attracting attention in bus stations and borrowed rooms. The full kind, the kind that has been held back by the accumulated discipline of years and comes out with the force of all those years behind it. She cried until she had nothing left. Then she wiped her face on her jacket sleeve and sat very still in the quiet. The old house breathed around her, whatever it was still doing in the absence of the people who had filled it. She had work to do. That night she slept in the cab of a 1991 Chevrolet she found in what had once been a garage behind the house, rust-eaten along the wheel wells, the cab dry and the cracked leather seats still holding the ghost of warmth from the afternoon sun. She curled up with her jacket over her torso and her backpack wedged against the door to block the draft, and she slept harder and deeper than she had in months. She woke before dawn to cold that felt personal, the kind of cold that finds the gap between your collar and your jaw and stays there. She pushed open the cab door and stepped out onto frost-crunched grass, and her breath came out in long, visible clouds. And then she looked up. The sky to the east was pink and orange and gold, spreading from the horizon like something on fire just below the edge of the world. The fields stretched out in every direction, silver with frost, catching the first light and throwing it back. The barn and the broken house and the wild grass all went still under it. Everything went still. Lena had grown up in institutional rooms and hired bunkhouses in the back seats of farm trucks. She had slept under more skies than she could count and worked through more seasons than seemed possible for 18 years. But she had never, not once in all of it, seen anything like that sky. My land, she said out loud to the empty morning. The words felt strange in her mouth. Foreign the way words feel when you are learning a language from the inside out, when you know the grammar, but the sounds are still new on your tongue. She said them again anyway. My land. She went back to the house as soon as there was enough light to work by. She had read Evelyn's letter a dozen times since finding it in the bottom of her mother's box. She had memorized the specific instruction look under the barn. The barn was in worse condition from the inside than the outside suggested. The main structure leaned east at an angle that made standing inside it feel like standing on a slow-rolling boat. Half the roof had come down, creating a mountain of collapsed timber and old hay and rusted hardware that filled most of the interior and made the air thick with ancient dust. But the floor was their wide wooden planks, dark with age, warped in places, but solid enough when she tested them one at a time. She started in the corner furthest from the collapsed section, moving along the wall, running her hands along the edges of each plank, feeling for a seam, a hinge, any variation that suggested something built underneath rather than simply there. 2 hours. Her knees ached. Her fingers were numb. The cold inside the barn was a different kind from outside, stale and still, and somehow heavier, the cold of a space that had been sealed from weather but not from temperature. She found it by accident. Her boot caught on something metal beneath a thick mat of old straw, and she went down hard on one knee. When she pushed the straw aside, she found an iron ring flush with the floor, the kind of ring set deliberately by someone who expected it to last. Smooth from decades of handling or the waiting for handling, large enough to grip with both hands. She pulled. Nothing. She braced her feet and pulled again. Nothing. A third time. A fourth. On the fourth pull, something gave. The hinges, old and stiff, turned with a sound like a complaint, long, low, reluctant. And slowly, inch by inch, a section of the floor came up. Below it, wooden stairs descended into darkness. Her phone battery was at 11%. She turned on the flashlight and went down. The room below was small, 8 feet by 8 feet, perhaps slightly less. The walls were lined with shelves built from the same rough lumber as the stairs, and the shelves held things that someone had put there with care, with thought, with the clear intention that whatever was stored here should last beyond the person who had stored it. Canned goods, dozens of them, some dating back far enough that the labels had faded to near illegibility. Tools wrapped in oiled cloth, the rust held off by the oil for years. Mason jars of seeds, their paper labels hand-lettered in careful print. A lantern and a box of matches in a waterproof case. A first aid kit, old but complete. And on a small wooden table against the far wall, a metal box. A strong box, the old kind. No padlock. Whoever had placed it there had decided the locked hatch above was security enough. Lena sat down on the bottom step. She put her hands on the lid of the box. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips. She opened it. Inside was money. $1,100, mostly 20s and 10s, bound with rubber bands that crumbled to dust when she touched them. An old leather journal, its cover worn smooth with handling its pages yellowed at the edges. A folded legal document that turned out to be the original homestead claim on the property dated 1923, signed by a man named Edmund Calloway in ink gone brown with age. And beneath all of that, tied together with a length of faded blue ribbon, a collection of envelopes, 47 of them in different states of handling, each one addressed in the same careful, slightly formal handwriting, each one stamped in red, return to sender, address unknown. Letters. Letters Evelyn had written to Jesse year after year, address after address, everyone returned. Under the letters, held together by a second ribbon, this one pink and frayed at the ends. 13 envelopes, smaller, each one sealed, each one numbered on the outside in pencil, 1 through 13, and on each one below the number a name. Lena Calloway, wherever you are. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she opened the first one. It was a birthday card, handmade, the paper cut from something heavier, a pressed wildflower dried and glued to the front. The petals still holding color, purple and pale yellow, the colors of something that had survived its own dying. Inside, in that careful handwriting, "Happy 5th birthday, my dearest Lena. I don't know where you are. I don't know if your mother ever told you about me. I don't know if you'll ever read this. But somewhere in the world you are turning 5 years old today, and I want you to know that someone is thinking of you. That someone loves you even from a distance you can't see across yet. Your great-grandmother Evelyn." She opened the second, the third, the fourth. Year after year, each card a small window into a life that had been running parallel to hers the whole time, never touching it, never knowing her, but recording her nonetheless. Evelyn wrote about the farm, about the weather, about how you could tell by February whether March would be kind, about the apple trees, which ones still bore fruit and which had given up, about a cat she had adopted when Lena turned 7 named Hope, who had lived to be 14 and died on a warm October afternoon and been buried under the old oak at the edge of the East Field. She wrote about waiting. That was the part that stayed. Page after page of it. The patient, unrelenting wait of someone who keeps a light on long after the hour when hope would tell you to put it out. "I keep your room ready," she had written in the card for the 11th birthday. "The quilt on the bed is one I made the winter you were born. Your mother told me your name in the one letter she ever sent. She never wrote again after that. But I've kept your name like a seed, Lena. I've kept your room like a promise." The 13th card was the last one. Lena opened it slowly, the way you open something you're afraid won't be as good as what came before it. The handwriting was different. Shaky, the letters uneven, the pen having pressed too hard in some places and too lightly in others, as though the hand holding it had become unreliable. "My dearest Lena, you are 17 now, nearly grown. I don't have much time left, and I think part of me has known that for a while. I want you to know that I've left everything for you. The land, the money under the barn, everything in this house that's still worth anything. It's all yours if you want it, if you can find it. I don't know if you'll ever see these words, but I wrote them anyway because you deserve to have someone write them. You deserve birthday cards and someone who thought about you on your birthday in a room with a quilt on the bed. You deserved all of it. I'm sorry I couldn't give it to you in person. Come home, Lena. Come home. All my love, your great-grandmother Evelyn." She had died 11 days after writing those words. Lena sat in the underground room that a man named Edmund Calloway had built during a war. He was afraid might end everything in the dark, with her phone flashlight slowly dying. And she cried with a completeness she had never before allowed herself. Down here, nobody could hear her, so she let herself make the sounds. She cried for her mother who had run from something she did not yet understand and died in a state she had probably never meant to stay in. She cried for Evelyn, who had written to addresses that never received the letters and made birthday cards for a child she had never met, and kept a room ready for 17 years on the strength of nothing but love and stubbornness and the refusal to accept that some things are simply lost. She cried for the version of herself that had grown up without any of this, without the weight of it, without the warmth of it, without a great-grandmother who kept a light on in the window. And when she had finished, when the crying had run its course, the way weather runs its course, she wiped her face on her jacket sleeve and sat very still in the quiet. Then she counted the money. $1,100. The back taxes were $6,200. But 90 days was 90 days. And she had a place to sleep and a set of rusted keys and a name that meant something in this particular piece of Montana ground. She put the leather journal and the 13 birthday cards and the 47 return letters carefully in her backpack next to the Polaroid photograph of her mother. Then she climbed back up the stairs. She pulled the hatch closed behind her and stood in the ruined barn in the gray morning light. Outside, the wind had come up from the west again. The grass moved in long waves across the fields, silver green in the early light. The whole surface of the land in motion, the way water moves when something large has passed through it. The farmhouse stood as it had stood for nearly 100 years, damaged and emptied and waiting, its broken windows open to whatever the sky intended to send. She looked at it for a long time. Then she put the keys in her coat pocket and walked toward it. The first thing she learned about Harlow, Montana, was that a small town notices everything. The second thing she learned was that it doesn't always let on that it has. She had been on the property for 3 days before anyone came. 3 days of working from first light until the darkness made it impossible, pulling debris from the collapsed section of the roof, hauling rotted lumber to the edge of the property, sweeping plaster dust from floors that hadn't been swept in years. 3 days of sleeping in the truck cab because the bedroom floor was too soft to trust. Eating crackers and peanut butter and the canned goods she had found in the underground room, testing each one carefully before committing to it, following the instructions in Evelyn's journal. The journal was full of things like that. Practical knowledge recorded in careful handwriting, the kind of knowledge that doesn't come from books, but from decades of living in a place and paying attention to what it teaches you. How to read preserved food before you opened it. How to bank a wood stove so the fire lasted through a Montana night. How to read clouds stacking on the western horizon for what kind of weather they were carrying and how many hours you had before it arrived. Lena read it every night by the fading light of her phone, rationing the battery the way she rationed everything else. On the fourth morning, she heard a truck on the road. It pulled up at the edge of the property and stopped, and a woman got out, white hair, cut short and practical, moving across the dead grass toward the house with the deliberate pace of someone who has made up their mind about something before they arrived. Lena came down from the upper window she was clearing of debris and met her at the door. The woman looked at her thoroughly, not rudely, in the specific way of someone matching something in front of them against something they carry in memory. "You're the girl who bought this place," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She kept looking. "The jaw," she said finally. "And the way you stand, like the ground might try to move and you're already ready for it." Evelyn stood like that. Lena didn't know what to say to that. "I'm Ida Keene," the woman said. "I run the feed and supply on Main Street. Evelyn Calloway was my friend for 60 years. She paused. "She talked about your mother. Every Thursday when she came in for supplies, she talked about Jessie. And when Jessie stopped coming home, she talked about waiting." "I know," Lena said. "I read the letters." Something shifted in Ida's face. The evaluating set of it changed, becoming less appraising and more human. She turned and walked back to her truck without a word. Lena thought that was the end of it. But Ida opened the tailgate, and in the bed of the truck were things. Rolls of heavy plastic sheeting slightly torn along one edge. A box of roofing nails, water-damaged and soft. A coil of rope. 2 tarps with small punctures patched with tape. "Inventory damage," Ida said, coming back with an armload of the sheeting. Not worth selling. Still usable if you don't mind working around the imperfections. Lena stared at her. I wasn't asking for payment, Ida said, her voice carrying the gruffness of someone deeply uncomfortable with being thanked. I was asking if you could use it. Something loosened in Lena's chest. A tightness she had been carrying so long she had stopped registering it as tension and had started registering it as just the normal state of being herself. Yes, she said, I can use it. That was how it started with Ida. The man came 2 days later. Lena was on the roof, or more precisely, she was attempting to be on the roof, having gotten herself up there by means of a ladder she found in the barn, and a determination that significantly outpaced her technical ability. She was trying to cover the collapsed section with the plastic sheeting before the weather that had been building in the west for 3 days finally arrived. The sheeting kept sliding. The wind kept working against her. Her hands were bleeding from where the nail heads had caught them, and she was beginning to understand in a very concrete way that there were things she did not yet know how to do. She heard boots on the ladder. A man appeared at the roofline. 25, she guessed. Dark hair, a face that didn't give much away, the kind of face that has learned stillness, because stillness is more useful than expression in most situations. He looked at the sheeting, at the way she had it half anchored on one side and flapping uselessly on the other, and without saying anything moved to the far corner and held it down with his knee while he drove 2 nails in quick succession with an efficiency that made her own efforts look exactly like what they were. He handed her a nail. She drove it in. They covered the section in 20 minutes. He climbed down first and held the ladder while she descended, a courtesy she hadn't expected and didn't know how to acknowledge without making it awkward. So she just said thank you. He nodded. His name was Boone Merritt. He worked part-time for Ida at the feed and supply, though he seemed to be there every day, which meant the distinction between part-time and full-time was one that existed mainly on paper. He had studied construction for 2 years at a community college before coming back to Harlow when his mother got sick. He had been back for 3 years. His mother had recovered. He had stayed. He didn't explain why he kept coming back to the farm. The first week, Lena assumed Ida had sent him. The second week, she started to suspect the truth was more complicated. The third week, she asked. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was always quiet before he said something, checking the words against some internal standard before releasing them. Ida asked me to check on you, he said. The first time. He picked up a board and tested it for rot, pressing his thumbnail into the grain, the way she had watched him do a dozen times reading the wood, the way some people read faces. He set it aside in the pile he was calling salvageable. My grandmother, he said, she got sick when I was 8. Bad sick. The kind that makes people feel like they need to be somewhere else. Evelyn Calloway came and sat with her through the worst night and didn't leave until morning. He picked up another board. My grandmother used to say that when someone does something for your family that they didn't have to do, you don't forget it just because the people are gone. I went back to work. That was the end of the explanation. It was also Lena understood the whole of it. He came every morning and he worked with a quiet competence that she found herself trying to learn from watching the way he read a structure before he touched it, the way he thought 3 steps ahead of the nail. He was currently driving, the way he seemed to understand what a building was trying to tell him about where it was failing and why. I taught her things not in the way of formal instruction, but in the way of someone who does a thing correctly and doesn't make a point of it and lets the watching do the teaching. She learned to test wood for rot before she committed weight to it. She learned to read a wall for where water had come in by looking at the staining patterns rather than the obvious damage, because the obvious damage was never where the problem started. One afternoon, he handed her a board and said to look at it. Really look not at the surface, but at the direction the grain was moving. You're not reading the wood, he said. You're reading where the tree was trying to go before it became lumber. She turned the board in her hands and looked at it differently. I was right. You could see it once you knew what you were looking for. The direction of growth, the record of wet years and dry years, the history of the wind written in the wood itself, in the angle of the grain, in the compression rings on the downwind side. Every piece of wood is a record, Boone said. You just have to know how to read it. Lena wrote that down that night in the notebook she had started keeping following Evelyn's example. She wrote it beside the entry about reading soil by its color and smell before you plant it in it. Beside the entry about how a 2-degree drop in overnight temperature changes what your body is telling you about the day ahead. She was building something in that notebook. Not just information, a way of being in a specific place. The accumulated logic of paying close attention to things that most people move past without stopping. Evelyn had been doing it for 60 years. Lena had been doing it for 2 weeks. Willa Pruitt, who ran the diner at the far end of Main Street, hired her the second week of April. 3 nights a week, washing dishes and mopping floors and doing whatever needed doing after the dinner rush cleared out. Minimum wage cash, no paperwork. When Lena asked why she was being so straightforward about the arrangement, Willa leaned against the counter and looked at her. Evelyn came in here every Sunday after church, she said. Same booth, same order coffee and whatever pie I had that day. She paused. She talked about Jessie all the time. She'd take out photographs and show me the same pictures every week, like she was afraid I'd forget what Jessie looked like if she didn't remind me. She looked at Lena in a way that was neither pitying nor sentimental, just honest. I guess she was right, she said, just not in the way she expected. Lena worked at that diner 3 nights a week through the rest of April and into May, scrubbing pots until her hands cracked and mopping floors until her lower back developed an ache that was becoming a permanent feature. Eating whatever Willa couldn't sell at the end of the night, which was sometimes the only real meal she had that day. It was not glamorous. It was survival done, the way survival usually gets done, not dramatically, but one small decision at a time, one morning after another, each day built on the day before it, with whatever materials were available. By late May, she had a roof that didn't leak in most places, walls that blocked the wind on all 4 sides, a kitchen cleared enough to cook in using a camp stove from the hardware store, running water from the pipes that Boone had tested and declared sound in the sections that mattered. And in the garden bed she had turned by hand along the south wall of the house, the first tentative green of seeds that had decided to take the offer she had made them. She had planted them from the jars in Evelyn's underground room, following the labels in that careful handwriting, following the instructions in the journal about soil preparation and spacing and when to plant for this specific elevation, in this specific valley, in the specific quality of the light that came down the slope from the west in the late afternoon. She had planted them like someone who expected to be here when they grew. In early June, on a morning when the fields around the farmhouse were beginning to show the first full green of the season, not the tentative early spring green, but the committed green of something that has decided to become itself a truck, pulled up that she had not seen before. New enough that the chrome on the front grille caught the sun and threw it back. A man got out. His boots were clean in the way that said expensive rather than unused. His smile arrived before he did, wide and warm, and not quite reaching his eyes. Miss Calloway, he said, like her name was something he had looked up. I wanted to come by and welcome you to the area. Introduce myself. Neighbors ought to know each other. He pulled a folded paper from the inside pocket of his coat and held it out. I also wanted to make you a fair offer, he said. $3,000 for the property as is. You could be settled and gone by the end of the month. Lena looked at the paper but did not take it. The property isn't for sale, she said. The man's smile held. Everything's for sale, he said. It's just a matter of finding the right price. He looked past her at the house, at the patched roof, and the half-rebuilt porch, and the garden coming up along the south wall. You're young, he said. You don't know yet how much it costs to keep a place like this running. The isolation, the winters, the 1,000 things that go wrong and keep going wrong. He brought his eyes back to her. I'm trying to save you the trouble of finding out the hard way. My great-grandmother kept this land in our family for 60 years, Lena said. I intend to do the same. The smile didn't leave the man's face, but something behind it changed. A small tightening, a recalculation. Evelyn was a stubborn woman, he said. Sat out here alone for years watching this place fall apart around her. Refused every offer I made. He folded the paper back into his pocket and walked toward his truck without hurrying. At the door he stopped. You have 90 days from the auction to settle the tax debt, he said without turning around. If you miss that deadline, the county takes it, and I'll be there when it goes back up. Then he got in. The chrome on his grill caught the sun on the way out. Lena stood in the yard and watched the dust settle on the road after him. His name, Ida would tell her later that afternoon, was Harlan Voss. He had been making offers on land in this valley for 30 years. He had a particular preference for properties where the owners were old or alone or in financial distress. He had a particular patience for waiting. I made offers to Evelyn every year for the last 15 years, Ida said. She was rearranging a shelf of seed packets in the methodical way she rearranged things when she was saying something that mattered. Every year she told him no. Every year he came back. She set a packet down precisely. He doesn't hear no as a closed door. He hears it as a door he hasn't found the right key for yet. Lena stood in the doorway of the feed and supply and looked at the main street of Harlow in the June afternoon light. The feed store at one end. The empty space where two storefronts used to be. The church with its hand-lettered sign. She thought about the $7. She thought about the rusted keys. She thought about a woman sitting in a Sunday booth with photographs of a daughter who wasn't coming back week after week, not giving up, not selling. He won't find the key, Lena said. Ida looked at her sideways. No, she said after a moment. I don't believe he will. Outside, the afternoon light came across the valley at the angle that Evelyn's journal had described the low golden light of Montana June that made everything look like it was lit from the inside out, that turned the fields the color of something worth keeping. Lena went back to work. She had a farm to run. And somewhere in the months ahead, Harlan Voss would find a different kind of key, not to her door, but to something buried 30 years deep in the county records. Something that had been waiting just as long as those 13 birthday cards had been waiting in the dark for the right person to find it. But that comes later. First there is summer. First there is a girl with flower-stained hands reading an old woman's journal by lamplight, learning how to read the clouds, stacking on the western horizon, learning what February says about March, learning the particular vocabulary of a place that has been waiting for someone to come home and listen. The lamp in the front window burned every night. She had started it practically. She sometimes came in after dark, and the lit window was easier to navigate toward than a dark house on a dark road. But it had become something else without her deciding to make it something else. Something she would understand the meaning of later when she found the letter. Something Evelyn had understood for 60 years before her. The light in the window that says someone is here. Someone stayed. Summer in Montana surprised her. She had not expected beauty. She had expected more of the same gray and cold and difficult, the continuation of a life that had always presented itself in the practical rather than the magnificent. Instead, she got mornings that smelled like grass warming up after a cool night, the specific green smell of a high country field coming alive in the sun. Evenings where the sky turned colors she had no names for. Long golden afternoons where the light came across the valley at an angle that made everything look like it was lit from the inside, the fields glowing with a warmth that seemed to come from the land itself rather than from anything above it. She learned things that summer that had no equivalence in any of the hired work she had done before. On someone else's farm, you learned the job. You learned what was needed today, this week, this season, and you did it with the particular efficiency of someone building competence that could be packed and carried to the next place. You did not learn the land, you learned the task. Here Lena learned the land. She read Evelyn's journal from beginning to end, and then started it again from the beginning, reading it slower the second time, absorbing it. The way you absorb something you have realized is more important than you initially understood. Evelyn had recorded everything, not just practical skills, but the reasoning behind them, the why underneath the how, the accumulated logic of a person who had thought seriously about how to live in a specific place for a very long time. How to read the soil before you planted in it, what its color and texture and smell told you about what it could and could not support. How to split wood along the grain so each piece came apart clean rather than fighting you. How to recognize the particular quality of light before a storm, the way it went flat and slightly yellow an hour before the clouds arrived. She planted the east field with the seeds from the jars in the underground room. She turned the kitchen garden to 3 times its original size. She repaired the orchard fence along the south property line and cleared the dead wood from around the base of the surviving apple trees, cutting back the overgrowth that had been slowly strangling them for years of neglect. The trees responded the way things respond to being noticed, after a long time of being ignored slowly at first, and then with a commitment that felt almost grateful. Boone came every morning and they worked alongside each other with the comfortable efficiency of people who have discovered that they operate at the same pace that their instincts about what to do next tend to align without requiring discussion. He was teaching her to read wood the way Evelyn's journal had taught her to read soil, not the surface of it, but the history embedded in its grain, the record of what the tree had been before it became material. One afternoon in July, they were replacing the last of the failed porch supports, and Boone held up a piece of salvaged oak and turned it in his hands. This one came from the old section of the barn roof, he said. See how the grain runs, the tree grew on a slope. You can tell by the compression on this side. He traced the line with his thumb. It spent its whole life leaning into the wind, and the grain shows it. Lena looked at the board. She could see it. Once he told her what she was looking for, she could read it the same way she could read the soil after Evelyn's journal had explained what the color was telling her. It was not magic. It was attention applied in a specific direction long enough and carefully enough to become knowledge. I had said it before, every piece of wood is a record, the first time he showed her, and she had written it in her notebook that night. Hearing it now in the grain of the specific board, she understood it differently. Not as a fact about lumber, but as a way of moving through the world. The understanding that everything carries the history of what it has been through, written into its material if you know how to look. She thought about the 13 birthday cards in her backpack. Each one a record. Each one, Evelyn looking at the empty space where Lena should have been and choosing year after year to address it anyway. By August, the kitchen garden was producing. Tomatoes and green beans and a row of carrots that came up, crooked but came up. She canned what she could, following the instructions in Evelyn's journal, step by step, checking and rechecking each seal, learning the particular sound a properly sealed jar made when the lid cooled, that small decisive click that meant the vacuum had held and whatever was inside would last. The porch was rebuilt. The roof no longer leaked anywhere that mattered. The upper windows had glass in them, again sourced from a building supply in Crossville that Ida had driven her to in June, refusing to discuss payment in a way that made payment impossible to offer without offense. Lena had stopped trying to account for everything Ida did for her and had started instead trying to understand the logic of it. Evelyn had sat with Boone's grandmother through a bad night. Willa had been given something she couldn't name by a woman who came every Sunday with photographs. Ida had been a friend for 60 years to someone who had kept a light on for a grandchild she had never met. The debt was not to Lena. The debt was to Evelyn, and these people were paying it forward to the only Callaway left to receive it. She understood that. She filed it in the notebook alongside the entries about wood grain and soil composition and cloud reading. It was its own kind of knowledge, the kind that told you something about how communities actually worked underneath the visible transactions. Harlan Voss came back in early September. He drove up on a Thursday afternoon when Lena was on the east side of the house clearing the last of the debris from the collapsed wall section. Real work, the kind that put dust in your hair and grease under your fingernails and left you understanding in a physical way what the structure had cost and what it was now worth. His truck looked the same. His boots looked the same. The smile arrived the same way it always did, slightly ahead of the rest of him. Looking good, he said, surveying the repaired porch and the cleared grounds and the garden along the south wall. He said it the way someone compliments a project they expect to own eventually. You've put in real work. Yes, Lena said. She kept working. $5,000, he said. That's my new offer. More than the market value on any honest assessment. He paused. You could take that money and start over somewhere with better fundamentals. A place that isn't fighting you every season. Lena set down the section of siding she had been carrying and looked at him directly. This place isn't fighting me, she said. It's been waiting. Voss looked at her for a moment with an expression she was becoming familiar with. Not quite pity, not quite calculation, something that lived between the two. Stubborn, he said, just like your grandmother. He said it the way he had said it in June, with the same flat delivery, the same implication that stubbornness was a failing that had cost Evelyn and would cost Lena the same way. This time Lena heard it differently. This time it landed like a compliment. Thank you, she said. Voss blinked. She picked up the siding again and went back to work. After a moment, she heard his truck start, heard it turn on the gravel, heard the sound of it diminish on the road back to town. Boone, who had been working on the far side of the barn and had heard the exchange from a distance, came around the corner. He looked at the road where the truck had been. He'll be back, he said. I know, Lena said. What he said about your grandmother, I know that too. He nodded once and went back to work. It was the entirety of the conversation. It was also in the way that their conversations tended to be the entirety of what needed to be said. October came hard. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a week and kept dropping. The first frost arrived early, taking the last of the garden before Lena had gotten everything in. She spent 2 days working in near-freezing rain, harvesting what she could salvage, her hands so cold by the end of each day that she had to warm them over the stove before she could write in the notebook. She wrote anyway. Every night, regardless of the cold and the hour and the state of her hands, she was building a record of her own now alongside Evelyn's. The two notebooks sat on the kitchen shelf side by side, Evelyn's worn smooth with 60 years of handling hers, new and stiff and accumulating. The accident happened on a Thursday in the third week of October. Lena and Boone had been working in the barn since morning, reinforcing the load-bearing beam that ran along the interior east wall. It had been showing signs of stress for weeks. A slight deflection visible from below, a sound it made under load that Boone had described as the wood talking and not saying anything good. The repair required working above the fallen section, in the space where the roof was still intact, but under significant lateral pressure from the damaged structure adjacent to it. Structures that have been compromised for years develop stress patterns that are not always visible until you begin working on adjacent elements. The beam they were addressing was connected to a roof section above it in ways that only became clear after they had already committed to the repair. Lena heard the crack before she understood what it meant. The sound of old wood giving up, sudden and total. The way a decision sounds when something has been holding it back for a long time and then stops holding. The beam shifted. The roof section above it moved. Boone saw it before she did. He shouted something she didn't catch and threw his weight against her, pushing her sideways and backward through the open barn door. She hit the frozen ground outside and rolled and came up, already turning back to look. The section came down in one piece. It hit where they had been standing and sent a cloud of dust and old hay billowing out through the open door. Boone was on the ground inside, half covered by the fallen material. He had gotten mostly clear. Mostly. His shoulder was at an angle it wasn't designed to be at. His face had gone the color of old concrete. He was breathing, she could see that from the doorway, but he wasn't moving anything on his right side. She dug him out with her hands and called for help on her phone, standing in the doorway of the ruined barn with the dust still settling. Her voice steady, because steady was the only useful thing she could do with it at that moment. The clinic in town was small but functional. The doctor told her in the waiting room that Boone's shoulder was dislocated and 2 ribs were cracked. He would be all right. He needed rest and time, and to stay out of collapsing barns for the foreseeable future. Ida arrived 40 minutes after Lena called her. She came through the clinic door with the contained energy of someone holding something large and forceful, very carefully in check. She looked at Lena once briefly, and then she looked away. When she looked back, there was something in her face that Lena had not seen there before. Not anger exactly. Something more controlled and therefore more serious than anger. She didn't raise her voice. That was almost worse than if she had. I asked him to check on you, Ida said. Not to risk his neck on that barn. Ida, she held up her. The gesture was not aggressive. It was final. That's on me, she said. I should have been clearer about what I was asking. She looked at the floor for a moment. Stay away from him while he heals. Give me some time. She left. Lena sat alone in the waiting room until the clinic told her she could go. Then she drove back to the farm on the empty October road and sat in the kitchen with the stove going and the notebook in front of her and wrote nothing for a long time. The second blow came 6 days after the accident. Willa Pruitt called her on a Tuesday evening. Her voice was flat with a tiredness that went past the financial into something deeper. The tiredness of someone who has been fighting small battles for a long time and has finally done the calculation on whether this one is worth what it would cost. Harlan Voss had purchased the building that housed her diner. He had done it quietly through a property management company with a name that didn't connect back to him unless you knew what you were looking at. The rent increase notice had arrived that day. Effective immediately double the current rate. I can't fight it, Willa said. I can't afford the new rent and keep the lights on both. A pause. I'm sorry, honey. I have to let you go. The diner closed 2 weeks later. Willa packed up what was hers and drove to stay with her sister in Ronan. On the last day, she and Lena stood in the empty diner together. Lena looked at the booth in the corner where Evelyn had sat every Sunday with her photographs. The vinyl seat faded in the center from 60 years of Sunday mornings. The window that looked out on Main Street in the particular angle of late morning light. She never stopped, Willa said quietly. Not for a single Sunday in all the years I knew her. She turned away from the window. She would have liked you. Lena went back to the farm. She sat down at the kitchen table and did the arithmetic. 90 days from the March auction had already passed. She had filed the initial payment extension with the county buying herself to January for the full settlement. The back taxes were $6,200. She had $40, no job. Boone was recovering across the county line near the clinic he would be attending for follow-up. Ida had asked for space. Willa was gone. In 1 week, she had lost Boone and Ida and Willa. She had $40 in 20-odd days until the January deadline. She sat with the numbers for a long time. She did not allow herself to look away from them. Numbers did not become better by being avoided and did not become worse by being looked at directly. And she had learned from Evelyn's journal and from 2 years of managing her own minimal finances that the only useful response to a number you did not like was to understand it completely. The number was $6,160. That was the gap between what she had and what she needed. She did not know where it was going to come from. She opened the notebook to a new page and wrote the number at the top. Then she wrote everything she had: the canned goods from the garden, the tools in the underground room, the $1 or $100 from the strong box already significantly depleted by the roofing materials, and the window glass and the hardware store purchases, and the food that had kept her working through the summer. Then she wrote at the bottom of the page, what would Evelyn do? She looked at that question for a long time. Evelyn would keep the light on. Evelyn would go to bed and get up in the morning and do the next thing that needed doing, because that was what 60 years of holding a place together had taught her. Not that it would work out, not that someone would come, just that the next thing needed doing, and the thing after that, and somewhere in the accumulation of next things, a life got built. Lena closed the notebook. She went to bed. She got up at first light and went to work. December came with the specific authority of Montana. December not gradually, not with the slow concessions that winter makes in kinder climates, but all at once like a decision that had been made and was now being implemented. The temperature went to 0 and stayed there. The ground froze to a depth that made sound travel differently, harder and sharper, every footstep on the frozen grass a small percussion. The sky turned white by day and a deep starless black by night. Lena learned things about cold that she had not known before, even after 2 years of working winters on other farms. She learned that it has layers, that the cold of early December is a different quality from the cold of late December, depending on how far from its source you are standing. She learned that a wood stove that heats a room adequately in November becomes something you have to manage deliberately in January, a relationship rather than a convenience, something that requires feeding and attention and a specific knowledge of when to add wood and when to let it breathe. She had read one section of Evelyn's journal 3 times without quite understanding why she kept returning to it. The section was about weather emergencies, about what to do when a person had been in the cold too long, the specific signs, the specific sequence of response, the specific reason that the instinct to warm someone quickly was exactly wrong and could kill them. You warmed a hypothermic person slowly working from the core outward because the cold blood in the extremities rushing back to the heart too fast could stop it. She had read it in summer when it seemed like theoretical knowledge. She had read it again in October when the first serious cold arrived and filed it as practical. She did not know reading it the third time in December that she was reading it for a reason. It was Christmas Eve. The temperature outside was 30 below zero. The wind drove snow sideways across the fields, making the air a white, undifferentiated thing, with no distance in it, no horizon, no reference point at all. The farmhouse held against it. The stove burned. The windows showed the particular frost pattern that meant the outer panes had been sealed by ice, and the inner panes were doing their job. Lena sat at the kitchen table with the stove at her back and the notebook open in front of her, and the number she had already looked at too many times this month, arranged on the page with the mathematical clarity of a situation that was not improving. She was thinking about giving up, not dramatically, not in the way of a person who has decided something final, in the practical way of someone who has run the same calculation many times and is beginning to accept what it keeps showing her. She had survived 2 years of hard road life before the farm. She could survive more. The county would take the property. Someone would buy it, probably Voss, who had told her he would be there when it went back up. And she would be back on a hired farm somewhere building someone else's life again, which she was good at, which was survivable. She could do that. She was sitting there with that thought, turning it over with the same deliberateness she turned everything over when she saw the lights. They appeared through the gap in the curtains, faint and irregular, moving up the road that led to the property. At first, she thought she was imagining them. Nobody drove in weather like this. Nobody who had a choice. But the lights kept coming, and they were moving wrong, weaving in a way that suggested movement with difficulty rather than intention. And then they stopped altogether at the low point in the road where the drainage ditch crossed. She put on every layer she owned. The cold outside was a different category from anything she had experienced. It was not a temperature. It was a presence. It pressed against every exposed surface and moved into the gaps between her layers with a speed and completeness that felt intentional, as though it had been waiting for her to open the door. She crossed the yard with her head down and the lantern held against her body to protect the flame. The ditch was 30 yards from the house. In that storm, 30 yards was a different kind of distance. She walked it, counting steps. The car was a small sedan, completely wrong for this road in this weather. Its rear wheels sunk into the snow-filled ditch. The engine running in the laboring way of an engine, working very hard at something it was never designed to do. Through the window, she could see shapes, people. She banged on the glass. A woman's face appeared. Dark-haired eyes wide, carrying in them an amount of fear that Lena recognized, the specific fear of someone who has understood exactly how bad their situation is and is past the point of pretending otherwise. She got the door open. "My daughter," the woman said. Her voice was raw. "Please, my daughter." In the back seat, a boy of 9 pressed against the door, and beside him, underneath a coat that had been arranged over her like a blanket, was a small girl. Lena reached in and touched the girl's face. Her skin was cold in a way that human skin is not supposed to be cold. Her lips had gone a color that Lena had read about in Evelyn's journal in the section she had returned to 3 times without understanding why. The blue-gray that meant the body had begun to redirect blood away from the surface and toward the core. The body's emergency response. Its last serious attempt to protect what mattered most. Lena had read those pages 3 times. She understood now why. "Move," she said to the woman. "Follow me and keep moving." The walk back to the house was the longest 30 yards she had ever covered. Inside, she did exactly what Evelyn's journal had told her to do, exactly as it had been described in the tone of someone who had learned these things not from reading, but from necessity. She wrapped the girl in blankets and placed her near the stove. Not close. Not close enough to feel the direct heat. Close enough for the temperature of the room to begin its work at the pace the body could handle. She told the mother to get under the blankets with her daughter. Skin against skin. Body heat shared the slow, careful way that bodies have been sharing it as long as there have been bodies in cold, and the stubborn insistence on survival. She kept the fire going and she watched and she waited. The boy who said his name was Owen woke up around midnight and came to see what was happening. He looked at his sister and his mother on the floor by the stove. He looked at Lena. His eyes were serious and dark and carried in them the specific quality of a child who processes things before speaking rather than while speaking. "They're going to be all right," Lena said. "Go back to sleep." He looked at her for one more moment, then he went. At 4 in the morning, the girl cried. It was a weak sound, a sound that cost something to make. But it was a sound. The woman on the floor heard it and pulled her daughter closer and made a sound of her own that was not quite a word, but carried more meaning than most words Lena had ever heard. "She's going to be okay," Lena said. The woman looked up over her daughter's head. Her name, she said, once she could say anything coherently, was Delia Vance. She had been driving to Billings. The storm had closed the highway. She had taken an alternate route she didn't know. The rest was the storm's story to tell. "You saved her," Delia said, looking at Lena across the room. Lena looked at the girl who was breathing now with the slow regularity of a child in real sleep. She looked at the fire she had kept going through the longest night of the year. She looked at Evelyn's journal on the table, the careful handwriting visible from across the room, the documentation of a woman who had known things and written them down so that someone else might know them too. "I had help," Lena said quietly, "from someone who figured I might need it someday." Delia Vance and her children did not leave after the storm. Not right away, and then not at all. It started practically. Her car needed serious work more than Harlow's one mechanic could turn around quickly. She had spent most of her emergency fund on the road before the storm. The job in Billings had already moved on. She had nowhere pressing to be, and two children who had survived something frightening and needed both of them to be somewhere that felt solid for a while. She was a bookkeeper by training. She sat down with Lena's finances on the third day and looked at them the way a bookkeeper looks at things, without the emotional weight that the person living inside the numbers brings to them. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said with the directness that Lena was already coming to recognize as her essential quality, "You need $6,160 in about 3 weeks. I can't produce that number, but I can help you manage what you have down to the last cent. And I can pick up bookkeeping work from the two businesses in town that aren't being managed well, and together those things might get you close enough that something else can close the gap." She said it the way a navigator names a position on a map. Not a promise, a coordinate. Here is where we are. Here is the distance between that and where we need to be. "What about you?" Lena asked. "Where are you going after this?" Delia looked at her children. Owen was outside in the cold, learning from watching how Lena stacked firewood, the particular overlap and air gap that let the pile breathe while staying stable. He had been doing it wrong the first time, and Lena had shown him without making a point of it, and he had done it correctly every time since, without being asked. B, who was 5 years old and apparently incapable of fear, had decided within the first day that she was responsible for the chickens and had named every one of them with the seriousness of someone assigning permanent identities. She called each one by name when she fed them in the mornings, clearly believing that being known and being cared for were the same thing. "I'm good at making things work with less than they need," Delia said. "I've had practice." Lena understood that this was not a request. She understood also that it was not precisely an offer in the way that offers can be declined. It was more like a statement of what was going to happen, delivered by someone who had looked at the situation and the available options and made the decision that made the most sense. "All right," Lena said. On the 10th day of January, Ida Keene came to the door. She was carrying a covered dish in both hands and had the look of someone who had argued with herself about coming, and the argument had been closer than she had expected. Lena stepped back to let her in. Ida set the dish on the kitchen table and stood looking at it for a moment. In the 3 months since Boone's accident, she and Lena had not spoken beyond the necessary. The space Ida had asked for had held its shape. Lena had respected it the way she respected all real things without trying to change it faster than it wanted to change. I heard about Christmas Eve, Ida said. She looked up at Lena. Word travels fast in a small town. Lena waited. Evelyn would have done the same thing Ida said. She would have gone out in that storm without thinking twice. She would have done exactly what you did. She reached into her coat pocket and produced an envelope. Evelyn left this with me years ago. She told me to hold it until someone from her family came home. She said if no one ever came, I could use it for the property taxes when they got too far behind. She paused. Her voice had the quality of someone reporting rather than explaining. I should have given it to you sooner. I wasn't sure you'd stay. Inside the envelope was a check. $3,000 written on an account with Evelyn Calloway's name printed at the top. The ink was not old. Evelyn had written it within the last few years with the deliberateness of someone who had thought through every contingency and prepared for it. The handwriting was the same handwriting as the birthday cards. The same careful, slightly formal hand that had been writing to Lena for 13 years without knowing Lena's address. There's one more thing, Ida said. She looked at Lena carefully. Boone is healing well. He's been asking about the farm. A pause. He'd like to come back and help finish the barn work when the doctor clears him. If you'll have him. Lena looked at the check in her hands, at the name printed at the top, at the handwriting that was Evelyn's handwriting on a document Evelyn had prepared years ago for someone she hoped would come. Tell him yes, she said. On a gray afternoon in the middle of January, Lena walked into the county clerk's office and put $6,200 on the counter in front of a woman named Doris, who had been processing paperwork in this building for 30 years and intended to do it for 30 more. She had counted the money 4 times before she left the farm. Doris processed the payment with the efficiency of a woman who has made an art of exactness. She stamped the receipt. Paid in full, she said. She slid the receipt across the counter. Then she paused a pause that Lena had never seen from her before. Doris was a woman of efficient gestures, and a pause meant something. Your great-grandmother paid that bill every year for 60 years, Doris said. Sometimes it wasn't easy, but she never missed it, not once. Lena took the receipt and folded it and put it in her jacket pocket next to where she kept the Polaroid photograph of her mother standing in the sun with her hand raised against the light and that defiant, almost daring smile. She walked out into the January afternoon. The sky was white. The air was cold. The road back to the farm stretched out through fields that were frozen now, but would not be frozen forever. Somewhere at the end of that road, a farmhouse stood with its new roof and its patched walls and its lights on in the windows. A farmhouse where Delia Vance was at the kitchen table doing the bookkeeping for 2 businesses in town, and Owen was stacking firewood in the exact pattern Lena had shown him, and Bee was in the chicken coop having what appeared to be a philosophical conversation with a hen named Clover. She had paid what was owed. She had earned the right to be here. She did not yet know about the access road or what Harlan Voss had been holding for 30 years or the truth buried in the county records. The complaint filed and dismissed the girl who had run to protect her family and spent the rest of her short life thinking she had abandoned them. That truth was coming. But first the farm. First the long road home in the January cold. First the lamp in the window, burning the way it had burned every night since a girl with $121 in her pocket and 2 rusted keys and a name she was only beginning to understand the weight of had walked toward a broken house in the Montana dawn and said out loud to no one and everyone, my land, and meant it. The paper arrived on a Thursday in April, not through the mail, through a process server who drove out from the county seat in a car that was too clean for the unpaved stretch of road leading to the farm, who knocked on the door with the practiced neutrality of someone who delivers difficult things for a living and has learned to do it without apology. Lena was in the garden when she heard the knock. She came around the side of the house with soil on her hands and dried mud on the knees of her jeans and the particular focused look of someone interrupted from real work. The man handed her the document and said she had been served. Then he walked back to his clean car and drove away, and the dust the tires raised on the road hung in the spring air long after the sound of the engine was gone. She read the document standing in the yard. It took her 3 readings to fully understand what she was holding. Harlan Voss, through a property management company with a name that did not connect to him, unless you knew what you were looking at, was asserting legal ownership of a strip of land along the northwest corner of the property. A narrow corridor, less than 30 feet wide, running from the county road to the edge of her acreage. The strip that the only road into the farm crossed. The notice stated that as of 60 days from the date of the filing, access through that strip would be restricted. 60 days. And her farm, which would still be hers, would be unreachable by any road. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the document for a long time without speaking. Delia came in from the back room where she had been working through the week's bookkeeping. She looked at Lena's face and sat down without asking questions, which was one of the qualities about Delia that Lena had come to value most. The understanding that questions were not always the right instrument. Lena slid the document across the table. Delia read it. Her expression did not change in any dramatic way. It changed the way a bookkeeper's expression changes when the numbers reveal something that was always there but had not yet been made visible. He bought this strip in 1998, she said, 26 years ago. He's never used it, Lena said. Never built on it. Never restricted access to it. No, Delia said. She looked up from the document. This is not how you buy land you intend to use. This is how you buy land you intend to use as a weapon when the moment is right. She said it with the flat accuracy of someone reading a figure from a ledger. It was not a judgment. It was a recognition. Lena had thought the same thing. She had not been able to make it sound like anything other than suspicion, which was different from evidence. Delia had named it in 12 words. Boone arrived that afternoon. He had been cleared by his doctor 2 weeks earlier and had come back to the farm with the unhurried reliability of someone returning to a commitment rather than resuming an obligation. His shoulder still slightly lower than it had been, the movement of it, careful and considered. He read the document on the porch with the same stillness he brought to reading structural problems, without rushing, without reaction, until the full shape of the thing was known. Then he folded it and handed it back to her. There's a man, he said, Corbett Farley. He practiced law in this county for 40 years before he retired. He lives out on the river road now. Fishes mostly. He paused. Ida told me once that he knows where every property line in this valley has been and where every deal in this county was made, and by whom and for what. Another pause. I'd want him to see this. Would he help? Boone was quiet for a moment in the way he was always quiet before he said something he meant. I think he's been waiting for a reason to, he said. They drove out to the river road the following morning. Lena and Boone in Boone's truck that smelled like sawdust and machine oil, and the particular combination of things that accumulates in a vehicle used for real work. The river road wound between cottonwood trees that were just beginning to leaf out in the pale, uncertain green of early spring, the color of something trying to commit. Corbett Farley's cabin sat back from the bank, modest, and carefully maintained the woodpile, stacked with the precision of someone who takes structural integrity seriously in every context. Howe was on the porch when they arrived, as though he had timed it. Howe was 74 years old, with white hair and a face that had spent 40 years in courtrooms and showed it watchful and patient, giving nothing away by accident. His blazer had probably been good quality 20 years ago and had been worn enough since to achieve the comfortable authority that expensive new clothes never quite manage. His briefcase, battered leather, sat beside the porch chair as though it had never been put away. He looked at Lena for a long moment before he looked at the document she handed him. The jaw, he said very quietly. He did not say it the way Ida had said it, with the warmth of recognition, with the relief of seeing something returned. He said it the way a man says something he has been expecting and has been dreading to finally see confirmed. He did not explain it. He sat down and read the filing twice in the unhurried way of a man who had read a great many documents and understood that the important things were always in the details rather than the declarations. When he finished, he looked up. "How long has that road been used to access your property?" "As long as the property has existed," Lena said. "There are references to it in the original homestead records. Anyone ever disputed access to it before? Not that I found any record of." He looked at a specific section of the filing. "He bought this strip in October of 1998, he said. 26 years ago. He never built on it, never developed it, never restricted access to it. Just owned it." He set the document on the table beside him. "That is not how you buy land you intend to use. That is how you buy land you intend to use as a weapon later when the circumstances require it." He looked at her steadily. "I'll take the case," he said. "I can't pay you right now," Lena said. "I can pay you eventually when things are—" He held up his hand. "I'm not interested in payment." He looked at Boone and something passed between them that suggested this had already been discussed. "I practiced law in this county for 40 years. I know what Harlan Voss is. I know what he does and how he does it and how long he has been doing it." He picked up his briefcase and set it on his knees. "I have been waiting 30 years for someone to give me a reason to walk back into a courtroom." He looked at Lena. "You've given me one. That's enough." He took the filing and a copy of every property document Lena had, and he went back to his cabin. For 3 weeks, she heard almost nothing from him. A phone call asking for a specific record from the 1923 homestead claim. A text message asking her to confirm a date she had found in the county's online archive. Silence that felt in the way that certain silences feel, like the silence of someone working rather than the silence of someone who has set something down. Spring moved across the valley with the slow authority of a season that has not been rushed. The apple trees along the south fence came into bloom, white flowers against the pale sky. The smell of them carried on the wind that came down from the mountains. The garden that Delia had helped expand through the winter. Planting was in the ground, the rows marked with the small wooden stakes that Owen had cut and labeled with the seriousness of a 9-year-old who had decided that this was important work and intended to do it correctly. Bee had claimed the 4 apple trees nearest the house as her personal responsibility and was conducting what appeared to be ongoing negotiations with each one about its flowering schedule. Life on the farm had found its rhythm, not the tentative rhythm of the first summer when everything was provisional, when each day was a question about whether this was sustainable or simply hopeful. This was the rhythm of something that had decided what it was. The rhythm of people who understood their work and did it, and went to bed tired and got up in the morning and did it again, and found in that repetition not monotony, but the particular satisfaction of building something real. Corbett Farley called on a Wednesday afternoon in early May. "Come to the cabin," he said. "There's something you need to hear." She drove out alone on the river road, the cottonwoods now fully leafed the green of them, full and committed. He was on the porch again, 2 mugs of coffee on the table. He waited until she was seated with the coffee in her hands before he opened the folder. "I've been pulling records," he said. "County property records, court filings, tax documents. Everything that touches on Harlan Voss's land acquisitions over the past 35 years. He looked at her over his mug. "There's a pattern. It's not subtle once you know what you're looking at. It's just been spread across enough time and enough individual transactions that no one ever looked at all of it together." "What kind of pattern?" "Hot buys from people who can't protect themselves," Corbett said. "Elderly landowners with no family nearby. Estates in probate with no clear heir. Property owners in financial distress who need to move fast. He finds them at the moment of maximum vulnerability and makes offers that are technically legal but structured in ways the seller doesn't fully understand." He turned a page. "Sometimes he waits. He bought that access strip and sat on it for 26 years, waiting for a moment when it would be useful." He slid a document across the table. The strip was sold to him in October of 1998 by a man named Thomas Calloway, Evelyn's brother-in-law, her husband's younger brother. Thomas had been living in the small outbuilding on the south end of the property since the early 70s. He was in his 80s by 1998. Lena looked at the document. $200. A strip of land that 26 years later was the legal instrument being used to cut her off from everything she had built. "There's a problem with the sale," Corbett said. He slid another document across the table, a medical record reduced to a summary in his handwritten notes alongside it. Thomas Calloway was diagnosed with vascular dementia in the spring of 1996. By 1998, his cognitive decline was documented and significant. There is a note in his file from his physician explicitly recommending that he not be permitted to make major financial decisions without supervision. He paused. The sale happened anyway. Thomas signed. His signature is on the document. But at the time he signed, he did not have the legal capacity to enter into a binding contract, which means, Lena said, which means the sale was potentially voidable, Corbett said. The land should never have transferred to Voss. His claim to the access strip has no legal foundation. The spring afternoon moved around them. A bird somewhere in the cottonwoods called twice and went quiet. The river, just visible through the trees, caught the afternoon light and held it. "But there's more," Corbett said. He opened a second folder, thinner. The documents inside older, the paper carrying the brittleness of things that have been filed and not touched since. In October of 1998, the same month as the sale, a complaint was filed with the county sheriff's department. He turned the document so she could read it. The complainant was a 17-year-old girl. She stated that she had evidence that Harlan Voss had obtained a property transfer through fraudulent means, specifically by inducing a person with documented cognitive impairment to sign a contract he did not understand. Lena's hands went very still on the table. The complaint was dismissed, Corbett said, 48 hours after it was filed. No investigation, no follow-up. The disposition listed is insufficient evidence, but there is no record of any evidence being gathered, reviewed, or considered. There is no record of the complainant being interviewed. He looked at her. The county sheriff in 1998 was a man named Dale Pewitt. He held the position for 16 years. He was Harlan Voss's first cousin. Lena looked at the name on the complaint. The name of the complainant, Jessica Calloway, 17 years old. The silence in the cabin was the particular silence of something that has been true for a very long time and is being said for the first time. She was 17 years old when she filed it, Corbett said quietly. And there is one more thing. He slid the last document across the table. A record from the county's public transit log, a document that recorded passengers on the regional bus routes for insurance and scheduling purposes. 1 week after the complaint was dismissed, he said a female passenger traveling alone boarded a westbound Greyhound at the Harlow Depot. The passenger's name was recorded as J. Calloway. She was listed as 17 years of age. There was no return ticket. The destination column reads unspecified. The room was very quiet. Lena looked at the transit record, at the date, at the single initial in a surname she carried, at the notation in the destination column that said unspecified, which was the bureaucratic recording of what it looked like when a 17-year-old girl boarded a bus alone at night in the middle of winter with no luggage and nowhere she was allowed to say she was going. "She didn't leave," Lena said. Her voice came out low. "Not the way it comes out when you are trying to be quiet. The way it comes out when something has shifted in the machinery of how you understand your own life and the adjustment is still happening." "She was pushed out," Corbett said. "She had evidence that could have destroyed Harlan Voss. She filed a complaint, and it was dismissed in 48 hours by someone who owed Voss more than he owed the law. And then something happened, something we don't have the record of, but can read from the consequence. And your mother boarded a bus in the middle of the night and never came back." Lena thought about the 47 return letters in the underground room. Evelyn writing to address after address, year after year of looking. She thought about the birthday cards, the careful handwriting growing shakier, the patient, unrelenting record of a woman who had kept a light on for a grandchild she had never met. Evelyn didn't know, Lena said. She didn't know why Jesse left. There's no way she could have, Corbett said. Whatever Voss said to your mother, whatever happened in the days between the complaint and the bus, it happened privately. Jesse apparently didn't tell Evelyn the reason she was leaving. Maybe she was protecting her. Maybe she thought the less Evelyn knew, the safer Evelyn would be. Lena looked at the window, at the river through the cottonwoods carrying the light of the afternoon downstream. She ran to protect her family, Lena said. That's how I read it. She spent the rest of her life thinking she had abandoned them. She never knew it was safe to come back. Corbett let the silence hold what it needed to hold. He was a man who understood that some things needed to be said and then needed room, and that the room was as important as the saying. When he spoke again, his voice had the quality of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has found the right place to set it down. I want to use all of it, he said. The fraudulent sale, the dismissed complaint, the record of your mother's departure. I want to put it in front of a judge and let the whole thing see daylight for the first time in 26 years. He looked at her steadily. There are risks. Voss has resources. He'll fight it. It may take time. What do you need from me? He picked up his coffee mug. Your patience, he said, and your permission. She drove back to the farm on the river road, through the leafed-out cottonwoods, into the late afternoon light that came across the valley at the angle she had learned from Evelyn's journal. The angle that made everything look like it was lit from the inside. The long golden light of a Montana May afternoon. She did not go inside when she reached the farm. She went to the barn instead. The rebuilt barn, its structure sound, now its roof pitched correctly for the angle of winter storms from the northwest. The lumber chosen with the care that Boone had taught her, each beam placed according to the logic of how load traveled through a structure. She sat down on the floor of the barn with her back against one of the posts and her knees pulled up and her hands loose in her lap. Then she cried. Not the public crying, the kind you had to manage for the comfort of whoever was watching. The private kind, the kind that does not perform itself, that has no shape other than the shape of what it is. She cried for her mother at 17 filing a complaint in a courthouse and watching it get buried in 2 days by a system that had been arranged against her. She cried for Evelyn writing letters to a daughter who could not receive them, writing birthday cards to a granddaughter she would never meet, keeping a room ready on the strength of nothing but the refusal to accept that some things are simply lost forever. She cried for the version of herself that had grown up without the weight of this, without the knowledge that she had been looked for, that someone had kept the light on, that the waiting had been real and patient and unending. When the crying had run its course, she sat very still in the quiet of the barn. Then she got up and went to wash her face and started making dinner. The following morning, she was in the east field before Delia was up walking the fence line that Owen had helped her check in the fall, looking at where the winter had worked on the posts, making the mental inventory of what needed replacing before the season put pressure on it. The sky to the east was the specific pink of a Montana morning that had decided to be beautiful about it. The field stretched out in the long light, the green of it full, and committed the early summer grass moving in the wind that came down off the mountains. She spoke out loud to the empty morning, not to anyone in particular. She didn't abandon you, she said. She ran to protect you, and she spent her whole life thinking you didn't know why she left. The grass moved, the light moved, the mountains stood in the distance exactly as they had always stood. It was not an answer. There were no answers available for the things that had been lost in the space between Jesse Calloway and the bus depot and the 47 return letters. Some losses did not have answers. They had only acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was what you gave them, and you went on. She went on. The courtroom in the Harlow County Courthouse was small in the way that everything in a small county is small, functional, unadorned, worn at the edges by decades of ordinary use. The windows looked out on Main Street, and Lena could see the feed and supply from where she sat, the sign that Ida had repainted when the old one became unreadable. And beyond it, the empty space where Willa Pruitt's diner had been, before Willa packed up and drove to Ronan, the building, sitting with plywood in the windows, waiting for whatever came next. Harlan Voss sat across the aisle with 3 lawyers in suits that cost more than Lena's truck. He had the look of a man who had been in rooms like this before and had always left them in better condition than when he arrived. His face was composed neutral, the face of someone who has learned that courtrooms reward patience, and that patience for a man with resources was something you could afford in abundance. The judge was a woman named Elaine Croft, gray-haired, precise, with the manner of someone who had heard a very large number of arguments and had developed an efficient method for separating the ones that held weight from the ones that merely made noise. She looked over the assembled parties once briefly, and then she looked at her documents. The hearing began. Corbett Farley presented his case with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has done this for long enough to know that rushing is a form of doubt. He began with the homestead records from 1923, the original claim that established the property in its legal boundaries and its legal access. He presented the easement documentation, a county filing from 1931 that formally registered the access road as a right-of-way attached to the Callaway property, a filing that predated Harlan Voss's ownership of the access strip by 67 years. Voss's lawyers objected. They introduced counter-documents. They argued alternative interpretations. Corbett addressed each objection in the same calm and steady tone, without acceleration, without visible irritation, the way a river addresses an obstacle by going around it rather than through it, because the river has time and the obstacle does not. Then he introduced the medical records. Thomas Callaway's documented diagnosis, the physician's recommendation, the timeline that placed the cognitive decline clearly before the date of the sale, the legal standard for contractual capacity in the state of Montana, which Corbett recited from memory with the accuracy of someone who had looked it up recently and the fluency of someone who had known it for 40 years. The lawyers across the aisle shifted in their seats. "Your Honor," Corbett said, "I have one further item to introduce." He opened the second folder. He presented the 1998 complaint filing in the same methodical way he had presented everything, giving the judge time to read it, not rushing her, letting the document make its own argument before he added his. This complaint was filed by a 17-year-old girl who had evidence of the fraudulent transfer we have been discussing. It was dismissed 48 hours later without investigation by the county sheriff at the time, who was the first cousin of the defendant. He let that sit. 1 week after the complaint was dismissed, the young woman who filed it boarded a bus out of Harlow and never returned. He placed the transit record on the table. Her name was Jessie Callaway. She was the granddaughter of Evelyn Callaway, the original property owner. She was the mother of the plaintiff. He looked up from the documents. "We cannot know exactly what was said to her in the days between the complaint and the bus. We don't have a record of a threat because threats of that kind are not generally committed to paper by the people who make them. What we have is the sequence. A complaint filed, a complaint buried in 48 hours by a compromised process. A 17-year-old girl on a bus in the middle of the night with no luggage and no destination. A family separated for the next 26 years. He paused. And a piece of land held in quiet ownership for 26 years, doing nothing, producing nothing until the moment a young woman bought the property at auction, and that land suddenly became useful as a tool to drive her off. The courtroom was quiet. Lena was looking at her hands in her lap. She had decided before she came that she was not going to cry in this room. She was going to sit here and hold herself together and let Corbett do what 40 years had prepared him to do. She looked up once at Harlan Voss. He was looking at the documents on the table in front of Corbett with the expression of someone who has been watching a game they believed they understood shift into something they no longer recognize. The composure was still there, the practiced neutrality of a man who had managed his expressions in adversarial situations for a very long time. But underneath it, something else was showing, something colder and less controlled. He was afraid, not of losing the access strip. Men like Voss absorb losses like that and restructured. He was afraid of the thing opening up behind it. The 30-year pattern that Corbett had laid out with the patience of someone arranging pieces that had always existed, waiting for the right room and the right light. "Your Honor," Corbett said, "we respectfully request two things. First, that the defendant's claim to the access strip be dismissed on the grounds that the original 1998 transfer was executed without legal capacity and is therefore void. Second, that all materials relating to the 1998 complaint filing and its dismissal be referred to the State Attorney General's office for review. He closed the folder. Judge Croft looked at the documents for a long moment. She listened to the response from Voss's legal team with the complete professional attention of someone who has learned to hear everything. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she looked at Voss. The look lasted no more than 3 seconds. It was not theatrical. It did not need to be. It was the look of someone who has seen enough to form a clear view and is not interested in performing otherwise. Motion granted on both counts, she said. The gavel came down. Lena sat very still for a moment after the sound. Beside her, Corbett closed his briefcase with the quiet efficiency of someone tidying up after a job completed. Boone, who had come and was sitting in the row behind her, put his hand briefly on her shoulder. She did not move yet. She looked at the front of the room at the judge, already moving on to the next matter, at the lawyers gathering papers, at the ordinary mechanical resumption of the business of a courtroom that had no idea what it had just given back. Then she looked at Harlan Voss. I was standing with his lawyers in a tight cluster, their voices low. His face was controlled again, the neutrality reassembled. But he looked older than he had when he walked in. Something had shifted in his posture in a way that was not quite visible but was completely real. The way a structure looks exactly the same after the moment the failure begins, but before the failure becomes visible to the eye. He did not look at her. She had not expected him to. Boone drove her back to the farm. She sat in the passenger seat and watched the main street of Harlow move past the windshield, in the ordinary way of a June afternoon, people running errands. A truck outside the hardware store, the empty building where Willa's Diner used to be. The road out of town opened into the fields, and the sky spread wide above them, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Some moments don't need words added to them. She thought about her mother at 17, boarding a bus in the dark, with a complaint that nobody would hear carrying evidence of something unjust, and having nowhere to take it that would hold. She thought about Evelyn writing the first birthday card on a winter afternoon, not knowing if the child she was writing to would ever exist to read it. She thought about the underground room and the iron ring in the floor, and the sound the hatch made when it finally opened. She had come a long way to sit in that truck on that road in that quiet. After a while, she said, "Thank you for bringing Corbett." Boone glanced at her. "Corbett brought himself," he said. "I just gave him a ride." She looked back at the road. "That was enough," she said. He nodded once, and they drove the rest of the way in the comfortable silence of people who have been through enough together that silence no longer has any awkward edge. Harlan Voss left Harlow in November. The formal evidence of it came through the county records when the properties began transferring a ranch held in his name for 20 years, a commercial building in town, several smaller parcels. The transfers happened over 6 weeks, processed with the quiet, systematic efficiency of someone liquidating assets under pressure. The investigation the Attorney General's office had opened had not yet produced an indictment. It would, Corbett told her, but these things moved on, legal time rather than human time. And the difference between those two time scales was something the legal system had never felt obligated to apologize for. What had happened already was enough to cost Voss his credibility in the county. His relationships with business partners who had spent years benefiting from association with him and had immediately concluded that continued association was no longer in their interest. His access to credit, the carefully cultivated reputation of a man who played hard but played within the rules. The reputation had been the most useful thing he owned. Without it, the rest was just property, and property could be taken. He drove out of Harlow on a Tuesday in late November on the county road that passed the access strip he had held for 26 years and used as a weapon exactly once. Lena was in the east field when she heard the truck. She watched it pass on the road below. She did not wave. She turned back to what she was doing, which was checking the fence line along the east boundary, preparing it for winter. She worked until the light faded and the temperature dropped to the point where working with her hands became impractical. Then she walked back to the farmhouse with the cold air coming off the mountains and the lights of the house visible from a long way off. The lamp in the front window burned the way it burned every night. In the spring of the third year, Lena was going through the contents of the underground room again, cataloging what remained, setting aside what was still useful, and what had gone beyond saving the canned goods too old, the tools beyond repair. She was working carefully because the room had always felt like something that deserved to be treated carefully, a place where someone had put thought and love and provision into the architecture of a future they could not see but believed in anyway. At the back of the room, behind the lowest shelf, pressed into the gap between the shelf and the wall and the way you press something when you want it to be found eventually but not immediately, was a small flat envelope. Not in the strongbox with the rest. Separate, placed deliberately as though it had been added after some other decision had been made. On the front, in Evelyn's handwriting, steadier than the last birthday card, shakier than the earliest letters, 3 words: "For whoever finds this place." Lena sat down on the bottom step. She held the envelope for a moment before she opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages written on the same paper Evelyn used for everything. The paper of someone who bought things once and used them completely, who did not believe in waste. "My dear one," it began, "I don't know who you are. I don't know if you're Jesse finally coming home after all these years. I don't know if you're someone. I never had the chance to meet someone who found this place by a road I can't see from here. It doesn't matter. You're here. You found it. That makes you family, whatever else you are or aren't." Lena read slowly. "This land has been in my family for 100 years. It's seen hard times and better times. It's buried people I loved and raised children I loved and held us when there was nothing else to hold on to. I've seen it in every season, in every kind of weather, in every difficulty. A piece of land can put in front of you. And I want you to know that it will hold you too. Whatever brought you here, whatever you're carrying, it will hold you." She turned to the second page. "All I ask is this: keep the light on, not for yourself, for whoever comes next, for whoever is out there in the dark on a road they don't know, looking for a place that has a light in the window. We are never as alone as we feel in the worst moments. The people who loved us leave pieces of themselves behind in the wood of the walls, in the soil of the fields, in the light in the window that says someone is here. Someone stayed. Someone decided this place was worth fighting for. They're still here, and now so are you." The letter was signed, "All my love for whoever needs it, Evelyn Calloway." Lena sat in the underground room that Edmund Calloway had built during a war he was afraid might end everything. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in her jacket pocket, in the inside pocket where she kept the Polaroid photograph of Jessie Calloway standing in the sun with her hand raised against the light and that defiant, almost daring smile. The two of them together in the same pocket. The grandmother who had kept the light on, the mother who had protected the family she thought she had abandoned. Lena climbed the stairs and pulled the hatch closed behind her. Outside, the barn was solid around her, its roof pitched correctly, its beams placed according to the logic of load. She put her hand on the nearest post and felt the solidity of it under her palm. She walked out through the barn doors into the spring afternoon. The fields were green with the full committed green of a season that has decided to be itself. The apple trees along the south fence were in bloom white flowers against the pale sky. The smell of them carried on the wind. Owen was somewhere in the east field, checking the fence line he had taken on as his responsibility, moving along it with the methodical attention of a 10-year-old who had decided that doing things correctly was more interesting than doing them quickly. Bee was in the garden conducting what appeared to be serious negotiations with the first row of sunflowers she had planted along the south wall from seed packets she had found in the underground room, apparently believing that consulting the plants about their own progress would encourage cooperation. Delia came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and crossed the yard toward her. She handed Lena a cup. They stood together without talking for a moment, looking at the fields and the mountains beyond them, in the particular permanence of a place that has decided you belong to it. I found something in the room, Lena said. A letter from Evelyn. She wrote it for whoever found the place. Delia looked at her. She wrote it for me, Lena said, even though she didn't know it was going to be me. Delia was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was thinking about something fully before she responded. What did she say, she asked. Lena thought about how to answer that, about the 2 pages in the inside pocket of her jacket, about the instruction in the last paragraph that was both simple and complete. Keep the light on, she said. That was the main thing. Keep the light on for whoever comes next. Delia looked at the farmhouse, at the window where the lamp burned every night. She already knew you'd do that, Delia said. She hadn't met me. Delia smiled. She left the letter, didn't she? She picked up her coffee and walked back toward the house, and Lena stood in the yard with the spring wind moving through the apple blossoms and the mountains permanent in the west, and the smell of the fields coming up warm from the ground. She thought about her mother, 17 years old and alone on a bus at night, carrying evidence of something unjust and having nowhere to take it that would hold. Arriving somewhere, eventually putting down the kind of roots that people put down when they know they cannot go back to where they came from. Keeping the letter from Evelyn in a cardboard box with a ring and a photograph, as though some part of her was always planning to come home. She thought about Evelyn at the kitchen table writing to an address that would not receive the letters, writing birthday cards for a child she had never met, keeping a room ready with a quilt on the bed, leaving a light on in the window for someone who might never come. She thought about herself, 18 years old, standing in a ruined barn with $1 or $100 and a set of rusted keys and a name she was only beginning to understand the weight of making a decision, not because she was certain it was right, but because the alternative was to keep going nowhere forever. And she had finally run out of tolerance for nowhere. Boone appeared in the doorway of the barn. He looked across the yard at her, and she looked back at him, and he held up the carved wooden sign he had been finishing for the past 2 weeks, the one he had not let her see until it was done. He carried it across the yard and turned it so she could read it. Callaway Farm, it said. Established 1923. The letters were burned into the wood with the careful precision of someone who had thought about each one before committing to it. Below the text he had carved a small image, a farmhouse with a window lit from inside. She looked at it for a long time. It's for the gate, he said. When you're ready. She took it from him and held it. She looked at the house and the fields and the lamp burning in the window, even in the afternoon light, and the apple trees in bloom along the fence. She thought about Edmund Callaway driving stakes into Montana ground in 1923, believing that what he was building would outlast him and matter to people he would never meet. He had been right about that. I'm ready, she said. They walked to the gate at the end of the drive together, and together they hung the sign on the post, and it moved slightly in the wind from the mountains, and the letters were clear and legible in the afternoon light. Callaway Farm, established 1923. She stood at the gate after Boone went back to the barn, her hand on the post, looking out at the road that led to town, and beyond town, to the highway, and beyond the highway, to everywhere she had ever slept on a bus, or behind a building, or in a borrowed bunk on someone else's land. She wasn't waiting anymore. She knew what she had. She knew what it had cost. She knew what she owed to the woman who had written birthday cards in the dark and kept a quilt on a bed and left a light on for someone she had never met and might never meet. She knew the only way to repay that kind of debt was to do the same thing forward for whoever came next, for whoever was out there on a road they didn't know looking for a window. She turned and walked back toward the farmhouse, toward the lit window, toward the sound of Bee talking to her sunflowers, and Owen coming in from the fence line with dirt on his boots, and Delia's voice inside saying something Lena couldn't make out, but recognized the way you recognize home, not by understanding every word, but by the feeling the sound makes in your chest when you hear it. The lamp in the window burned as the afternoon moved toward evening. Visible from the road, visible from the highway on clear nights, a fixed point for anyone out there who was looking for one. She had promised to keep it on. She intended to keep that promise for a very long time.